Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's very special event of our Curated Conversations lecture series. My name is Peter Huggins. I'm the event producer. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation by Dr. Wintle on Postwar Museum Storage, bifocals, Shelving the Empire, Performative Change in Postwar Museum Storage. Again, tonight's event is live here at Homewood campus. We're also streaming live. Tonight's presentation will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel. During this evening's presentation, if you have any questions, please post them to the Q&A section in the chat, and we will be posting those questions later on to Dr. Wintle. Right now, I'm going to turn the evening over to our moderator, Dr. Rebecca Brown.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's just really a pleasure to be here. Welcome to this event, which is a History of Art seminar series event, co-hosted with Advanced Academic Programs in Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage Management here at Hopkins. We would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Piscataway tribe, who, among other indigenous groups, continue to steward the lands of the Chesapeake Bay region, where Johns Hopkins University is situated today. As Peter said, I'm Rebecca Brown. I'm professor in the Department of History of Art and chair of the Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage Management programs in AAP. And I'm just thrilled to be bringing these two aspects of Hopkins together here in this event, both in the room here in Baltimore, on Hopkins Homewood campus, and online via Zoom, where the talk is part of our program's Curated Conversations series, as Peter mentioned. In addition to that online participation, we also have the program director, Dr. Sarah Chacon, and assistant program director, Dr. Stephanie Brown, here with us in person, along with a group of students from the MA programs who are in Baltimore and DC for their intensive site seminar. So yay, a hearty welcome from all of us here at Homewood. This talk has also been generously supported by the Museums and Society program at Homewood, which is separate from the Museum Studies AAP program. Museums and Society serves our undergraduate population who are interested in museums across a huge range of disciplines. Also supported by the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, the Global South Humanities Institute, and the Department of Anthropology and the Department of the History of Science and Technology. So all of those people are coming together here to make this possible. So now I have the honor and delight to introduce to you my good friend and colleague, Dr. Claire Wintle, who is our speaker this evening. She has long been at the forefront of critical museum studies, and I actually first encountered her, I won't tell you how many years ago, when she was finishing her PhD at the University of Sussex, focused on colonial era exhibitions and histories of display of South Asia, particularly engaged with questions around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, a project that became her first book in 2013. At the University of Brighton, she has been instrumental in building one of the best graduate programs in the world, focused on museum histories, museum practice, and design history. I should probably bracket that and say, except for Hopkins, obviously. But leading the Center for Design History and always working directly with museum practitioners, both in Brighton and across the UK. And that experience of working directly with people who are themselves working in museums has really grown into a multi-pronged collaborative research projects that all focus on curatorial practice in the UK, particularly between 1945 and the present, or 1945 and 1980. And she's been digging into what the curatorial profession looked like. Who was hired? Through what mechanisms were they hired? How did they professionalize the field after World War II? How did they grapple with the so-called end of empire and political decolonization in this period? So from this sort of these sets of questions, she's been awarded a massive AHRC grant entitled Making Museum Professionals, 1850 to the Present, which she's co-leading with a colleague. She's co-edited a book entitled Cultures of Decolonization, and she's hosted a recent conference on museum exhibition design histories with her PhD students that will be coming out as another edited volume very soon. She continues to work directly in and write about South Asia as well, looking at post-47, 1947 exhibitions of India in the UK, and collaborating with a colleague on using data technologies and digital media to support the dissemination and recording of craft practices in collaboration with colleagues at NID, the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, and craft workshops in Western India. She has recently and happily just completed her second single author book, out later this year or early next. I know she's like, that's optimistic. Anyway, I'm being optimistic, which I've had the privilege to read in its early stages. There she does a deep dive into the machinations underway as British ethnographic museums grappled with the post-World War II end of empire. Rather than what we kind of imagine this period to be, which in my head, at least before reading her book, was moribund, dusty, conservative museum culture of like the 1950s, right? Claire's archival research and oral history interviews uncover the dynamism of this moment for UK museums when they started figuring out how to serve burgeoning immigrant communities, developed new survey instruments like visitor engagement studies, should get our MA students excited right now, grappled with the ethics and scope of the global collections they held, took new collections from former servants of empire with mixed results, as you might imagine, and remade the very technologies and architectures of the museum, particularly in relation to storerooms. So we'll be hearing a piece of that book tonight. I should just, as a sidebar, say that we say museum storage. Storerooms is another word that we use, and in Britain they also say stores. So don't be confused. Stores does not mean museum shop. It means storage. Okay, just doing some British translation here. Before I turn over the podium, you've already had some notes about the Q&A from Peter, but just let me remind you, those on Zoom, please post to the Q&A section. They'll be gathered and relayed to us here in the room, and Claire will be able to answer them. For those in the room, we're going to take questions after the talk as well, and we're going to ask you to actually come up to the mics to ask a question. So if you have a question, just prepare bodily to move yourself up to the mic. And then because we want to make sure the people on Zoom can hear your question from the room, one of our PhD students, Danny, is going to be madly transcribing your question onto chat for the people on Zoom. For those here on campus, and sadly not for those here on Zoom, but for those here on campus, we have a reception after the talk. So I want to encourage you to come to migrate with us to the History of Art department, which is just 2 buildings away. It's not far, where we will have wine and cheese and snacks, including gluten-free options. And we hope that you'll join us to continue the conversation afterwards. For now, please join me in welcoming to Hopkins, both virtually and in person, my colleague, Dr. Claire Wintle.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was lovely. So thank you all for being here. It is such a glorious day. So I'm so glad and grateful that you've come to sit in this darkened room to talk about dark spaces with me. I feel rather guilty, but hopefully we'll have a nice time together over the next 45 minutes or so. So yeah, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, colleagues in the History of Art department and also the AAP in Cultural Heritage Management. You've all made me feel so welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So we are in a moment of great storage enthusiasm. The depot at the Museum Boijmans van Woningen in Rotterdam was billed as the first publicly dedicated, accessibly art storage facility in the world. This is the V&A East Storehouse, which is a new big program that's been developed over the last 10 years that's about to open. And the idea is that the V&A storage collections will be accessible for all. I've also put the Smithsonian American Art Museum's open storage for you there, because it's a bit closer to home for some of you at least. So everywhere we look, the opening and sharing of the physical spaces of museum storage is en vogue. At the British Museum in London, a recent exhibition curated by Guyanese British artist Hugh Locke evoked a storage aesthetic to demonstrate the exhibition's intention to interrogate the museum's colonial past. So visitors were able to peek into mock crates, and paintings were displayed on reconstructed racking. Only small amounts of collections, as many of you know, can be displayed, and the British Museum famously only displays 1% of its collection. So in this context, this new attention to storage and making museum storage more visible feels radical. It feels ripe with opportunities to turn a long history of inaccessibility and hierarchies of professionals versus visitors on their head. It feels like a moment of innovation and professional change. Now, as Rebecca said, I'm a historian of museums, although I do spend quite a lot of time teaching and thinking about now. But I'm currently working on a post-1945 museum practice project in the UK. And as Rebecca said, my first book was on 19th century colonial collecting and display. But I'm currently focused on what happens to these huge collections of cultural heritage from Asia, but also Africa, Oceania, and the indigenous Americas in British museums after 1945. So, how did practitioners deal with the imperial collections that their donors had acquired, including through plunder and violence? What happened in the post-war period? What did they do with all this stuff? So I'm really interested in this period between 1945 and 1980. We know, I think, a lot about museums in the 19th and early 20th century. There's lots of very interesting books on museums and empire, curating empire, that kind of thing. And then moving on to the 1980s, and more recently, those ethical and practical challenges of the last 40 years of museum work feels really well trodden. And we can think, these are some of my favourites, we can think about some of the seminal texts of the 90s, but also some of the more recent stuff that's been generated that kind of really grapples with contemporary practice and how we can kind of be better as museum professionals. But in all that kind of huge amount of literature and reflection, the mid-century period between 1945 and 1980 remains relatively unexamined. I think it's slightly different in North America. I'm slightly worried I'm pitching to the wrong audience because in the in the US and Canada also, there's been a lot of really important work done on indigenous museums and African American museums and how they kind of really grew up in the kind of 1960s period particularly. And then, of course, in Canada, the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia is a really exciting space that's had a lot written about it in that kind of in the 1970s in particular, particularly in relation to open storage, actually. But always slightly behind the times. In the UK, the post-war period often appears as the dark ages of the museums. And these are years that are often dismissed as stagnant or irrelevant. But as Rebecca mentioned, my project, I think, suggests that that's not the case. And actually forgetting about that period means that we forget about some of the foundations for our current practice that we really need to interrogate properly. So I argue in the wider book that this was a critical moment in museum history in which those important foundations of professional practice as we know it were forged. I look at collecting, I look at deaccessioning, so the early history of repatriation in the UK. I look at conservation practices. These are some of my favourite images of technicians trying to freeze or kind of solidify First Nations sand paintings. I also think about early histories of documentation, very much inspired by Hannah Turner's work, and mid-century exhibitions as well. But the work I'd like to share with you today focuses on museum storage, and I'm right in the middle of it, so I'd be really grateful for kind of comments and gentle criticism would be very welcome received. So I'm in the US, so I feel like I need to give you a little bit of context for the British framework, although I'm sure some of you know it well. I just wanted to give a bit of context also because, as we know, museums are never separate from the outside world. The post-war period in the UK is characterised by the collapse of the British Empire. India gained independence in 1947, and the former British colonies in Africa and in the Caribbean followed suit in the 50s and 60s, and things kind of rolled from there and are still going on today. And this led to a deep British ambivalence and anxiety over its national status. In parallel, post-war migration increasingly diversified British society, often leading to public expressions of racism and hostility, but also demands for change and anti-racism and kind of shifts in society very slowly. In museums, documentation, collecting, storage, display, they've all been highlighted as classic modes of museum work that were designed sometimes to mimic and reinforce imperial hierarchies. And that was especially the case in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And in some ways, the post-war period, when all these changes were happening, feels a little bit different. Long-term practices were reconsidered and reframed. However, while the empire appeared to be crumbling within and beyond the museum, it was still very much present. And as we know, imperialism, sadly, is still very much with us today, even if in slightly different guises. And in my wider book, I argue that post-war museums, the majority of these so-called innovative practices actually led to the re-entrenchment and consolidation of imperialism. So post-war museums were infused with some of the anti-racist, anti-colonial and social justice movements that were slowly building in British society and globally, but much of this professionalization in the museum was designed to maintain the status quo, and storing museum collections was an important part of that grappling with the reframing and re-entrenchment of empire. And in fact, while we might think that some of this storage mania is new, in the post-war period, storage was also a hot topic. Questions of access, visibility, the balance between public display and behind the scenes were all critical. And they came up with a whole range of strategies for addressing storage. And some of these activities involved grappling with the spectre of empire that dominated the period. And so right now, we're in this moment of working through how histories and legacies of imperialism intersect with museum practice. And what I hope is that we can learn from this period, this early period, and especially the mistakes or the limits of what they were able to do. So I just want to say a little bit about my methods. It's really nice to have such an interdisciplinary group today. My arguments here are really grounded in kind of extensive archival research. I've been spending far too long digging around the archives of museums, national, local, regional, university museums, and so trustee reports, curatorial correspondence, meeting minutes, public guidebooks, newspaper clippings, everything. I also conducted several oral histories with people who were working in museums in the 1960s, well, yeah, few still around from the 1960s and 70s. But I'm also interested in the visual culture of museum practice as a site of analysis. So I did a quick Google search, museum conservation. Museum people like taking pictures of each other these days, and they like uploading them to websites to show all the exciting things they're doing behind the scenes. But actually, museum practitioners have been generating photographs of their labour for decades. And in this fairly recent book about unaccessioned photographs in museums, Elizabeth Edwards and Ella Revilius highlight the range of images that are generated in museum work. So here, these are just examples from their book that I've taken here. So of museum displays, of museum employees in their new uniforms, photographs that might be taken for condition reports. I'm sure those of you who are museum practitioners see these kinds of things and take these kinds of things all the time. And this one in the middle, right at the bottom, is quite nice, I think. It's the Victoria and Albert Museum's first official museum photographer, captured in his own image of the museum's accessioned Venetian mirror frame. And in this book, Edwards and Revilius quite rightly suggest that while these images might have been accrued serendipitously and assembled sometimes absent-mindedly, they nevertheless manage, reproduce, and disseminate the museum's value systems in critical ways. So we'll be looking at lots of pictures of museum storage today. I'm getting really over-enthusiastic about pictures of museum stores, so bear with me. I'm sure we'll all have a nice time. But the idea is that we read them critically and we interrogate their content, their framing, their materiality, their purpose, and their circulation. So, to post-war museums. So, these are just a random selection of post-war devastation in British museums after 1945. Actually, it's not that random. I chose the worst ones to shock you. Are you shocked? But having said that, the state of the UK museum sector in the 1940s and 50s, particularly for what were then termed ethnographic collections, was almost uniformly dire. The war had ravaged museum buildings and collections. As staff slowly returned from war duty, there were very limited resources to help with the rebuilding efforts. And case upon case of registered objects returned from makeshift wartime storage depots, and these collections were hurriedly placed in already cramped storerooms, often divorced from their documentation. So in 2014, Hilary Gogan and Alison Hess, two cultural geographers, developed the concept of object love in an article that they wrote about the museum storeroom as a warm, affective, embodied space in which people and things care for each other. They describe object love in the museum as linked to bell Hooks' conception of love as a combination of care, commitment, trust, knowledge, responsibility, and respect. But compared to this nurturing, cosy object love, the annual reports, correspondence, and meeting minutes of British curators in the post-war period are also infused with a haptic, emotional response to their collection that frames the volume and the responsibility and the sheer materiality of their collections as dangerous, as a serious overextension of the museum and the imperial project. And instead, what I argue, what comes out is an object anxiety rather than an object love. And I'm sure that there are some curators in the room who often feel a little bit anxious about all the objects that they have to care for. And actually, I mean, this is perhaps a slightly flippant comment, but at the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography, staff referred to grisly cupboards, and the curator complained that his ever-increasing collections and their substandard accommodation would one day place him in the, quote, loony bin. And actually, storage facilities were particularly problematic. At the British Museum, annual reports were characterised by consistent complaints about overcrowding and damaging temperatures and humidities. Peruvian mummies in a basement store were saturated by steam from a burst pipe. Insect damage had completely destroyed several objects, and as the curator mourned in 1959, the fact that specimens have been infected long enough for complete destruction to take place without detection implies a failure of routine inspection. And the British Museum's Keeper of Ethnography, H.J. Brownholtz, coined the phrase invisible storage in 1953 to express his concern about how his museum's collections were increasingly concealed from view and thus divorced from proper opportunities for access and care. So objects had to be packed up in boxes to preserve them from dirt, but this also meant that they could no longer be readily seen or consulted. And he used his annual report to advocate for further resources, noting how invisible storage led to great embarrassment for users and for staff alike. And the buildings that were available for collection storage were a particular source of concern. So this is a contemporary Google image of Belfast's ethnographic store, the Ulster Museum's ethnographic store today, so it's not there anymore, I should hasten to add. But this was where Ulster Museum's ethnographic store was in the 70s. And actually, that idea that it's a domestic space, that it's a house located fairly closely to the museum, was remarkably common amongst museums across the UK at this time. And these former domestic spaces created troubling conditions of collections access and arrangement. And in Belfast, the main ethnographic store, the curator at the time, who was a research assistant actually in the department in the 1970s, remembers this space as looking like somebody's attic, and how the collections were just everywhere, stuck on shelves and everything. Storage was very much a kind of mishmash. Fragile things were put in cardboard box or something so that they weren't stomped upon, but really there was no sorting out of, African stuff goes here, Polynesian stuff goes there. I mean, there wasn't anything like that really. And a similar situation developed at the Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford, where adjacent collections in store at 18th South Parks Road were later described by a former curator as dank, dilapidated former dwellings into which vagrants had forced access. Every corner, including the bathrooms, had to be stuffed with objects of astonishing quality and historical as well as ethnographic value. So these are kind of reflections from a new generation of practitioners who'd recently entered the museum profession, and they suggest that concerns about the impact of such environments on collections and the staff who cared for them were intensifying by the late 70s or 60s and 70s. and that the demands of the global south and shifting perspectives on the validity of empire influenced some of them. And in particular, I'd like to introduce you to Peter Gathercole, who was the director of the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography in Cambridge in the 70s. And he makes this purposely provocative statement designed to campaign for substantial new storage facilities. And he points to the correlation between the damning state of collections care in the UK and the politics of decolonisation. So he describes the Pacific collection at his museum as crammed into grossly inadequate stores. He argues that some of my Antipodean colleagues have rightly cascaded this situation as a disgrace, and they do not exaggerate. If we cannot look after this material properly, it should be returned to the South Pacific. That area now possesses museums better able to safeguard it on behalf of the peoples concerned, from whose ancestors it was obtained on what now constitutes false pretenses. And he also says that there are other collections in his museum to which those strictures can be applied. So Gathercole is not really a typical museum curator at this time. He was trained in New Zealand, where kind of professional practice had really shifted in response to Indigenous agendas and much more kind of influential than they had been in the UK at this time. And he was also a communist and a socialist, so much more attuned to kind of political frameworks through which to see his collections. But I think that the unruly and uneasy spectre of empire also holds an uneven sway over the museum sector more broadly throughout this period. And we see this kind of increasing disquiet and concern about British imperialism that's now part of British culture and politics. And if a guilt and anxiety about the history and legacy of colonial rule, and simultaneously a concern about its impending demise, inflected wider British society at the time, it also influenced approaches to museum practices of storage. So I want to show you a series of photographs taken of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford as one example of how this social unease was expressed. And they were taken just prior to the demolition of the site in 1973. And I think that they evoke this ominous, dramatic, and almost Gothic anxiety that's rooted in imperialism and its supposed decolonisation. So I think it's likely that these images were taken by the museum's in-house photographer, Peter Narracott. The museum had a dark room, so they had opportunity to develop these photos professionally. They're using a flash in there, so there's a kind of high-level, high-quality imagery that's being taken here that probably wasn't accessible to everyday photographers at the time. And the fact that they're black and white likely means that they're kind of developed in the museum in the darkroom, rather than by that time kind of amateur photography would probably be using colour by this time. And I think, like I say, they're more than snapshots then. They're skilled in their composition and their development, and they therefore kind of offer a careful framing and stylised character of the museum's history and how it was understood by those who worked there in the 1970s. And so, guided by kind of Revilius and Edwards that I introduced earlier, we can understand these images to construct and reflect shifting institutional values as they are performed. One thing that we can do is look to scholars of late 19th and early 20th century neo-Gothic literature to help us think about these images, especially where they have shown how the cultural outputs of that earlier period, so 19th century, early 20th century, addressed popular concerns about empire and its consequences. So Tabish Kir describes how literary fiction grappled with the nightmares and anxieties of empire brought home to roost in the British countryside, the British metropolis, and the British castle. And Elise Bulfin describes an invasion anxiety in 19th century Gothic literature, where this exaggeratedly menacing external aggressor acts to destabilise British security and articulates the fear that there was a price to be paid for ceaseless imperial expansion. And partly because this image is black and white and the building is Gothic, I kind of have been quite kind of taken by this idea of thinking about these spaces as Gothic and as spaces that kind of might challenge their kind of owners and users to think about kind of ideas around this, this idea of ceaseless imperial expansion. But while these books have a concern and focus on the expansion of empire in the 19th century, our museum images show how a similar concern influences museums as empire contracts a few decades later. So these pictures are replete replete with motifs of fear and haunting, and they appear deeply concerned with both the nightmarish intrusion of the past upon the present and the Gothic's fundamental occupation with antagonistic otherness and boundaries transgressed. So in the outdoor image, for example, we see these kind of creeping, ominous branches of a winter tree that scratch across the field of vision, and they frame the shadow Victorian Gothic building beyond and the dangers within. The interior photographs present a domestic space that's poorly adapted for museum use, and it compromises those kind of accepted boundaries of work and home life. And they draw attention to the original oppressive Victorian patterned wallpaper and the physical bulk of the decorative balustrades. And in their documentation of this kind of overbearing, aggressive material claustrophobia, they seem almost designed to illustrate the domestic Gothic genre, in which the house has the power to unnerve, fragment, and even destroy its inhabitant unless something is done to arrest it and restore order and normalcy. So these images show the deteriorating historic space and the unchecked colonial collections that have been amassed over many decades, as well as overwhelming the professional standards of the post-war museum. Piles of object-filled crates block escape routes. In the centre, the rough-hewn wood of a canoe prow jostles for space with the highly polished wood of the balustrade. And on the right, a technician is depicted as attempting to impose control over the collections through boxing and labelling, but the piles of objects in the background and the framing of the photograph taken kind of fairly closely betrays the kind of claustrophobia of the space. And we've got kind of bars on the window that kind of ostensibly keep out unwanted intruders, but they also kind of block people in, and can just imagine being in this space. It's just kind of completely exhausting and slightly kind of intimidating. We can read these visualizations of the storage facility in their focus on both Victorian domesticity and the overwhelming colonial collections they hold as evoking the imperial excess that threatens the stability of the museum. But despite the material and psychological challenges faced, British curators were not willing to acquiesce to these troubled conditions of museum storage. And museum curators resented this lack of oversight, efficiency and control, and the implications of what was clearly a declining, dysfunctional empire. New sites and new methods were pragmatically employed in the museum in an attempt to regain control. And the development of new professional standards and a range of experiments in museum storage were presented as solutions to this object anxiety and its imperial overtones. So one solution to this pressing need for collections accommodation was to sacrifice display space. So here at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery, for example, carpenters build out a big bay at the end of one gallery, and the first side of the bay contains display cases, while the second side, behind the bit at the back here, contains large racks for stored objects to be hidden among sliding doors. And so that's one kind of way in which lots of museums sacrifice display space in order to grapple with these problems. But as government funding increasingly found its way to museums in the 1960s, there became an alternative to this juggling of collections with display space. And so there are several major new museum building projects that prioritise storage, and they were planned all over the country. So back to Belfast, for example, a new extension to its original 1920s neoclassical structure was proposed by Francis Pym. And so the original building is here, kind of 1920s neoclassical. But the new, hyper-new concrete block embraces the old building and creates a kind of sandwich storage area in the middle. And if traces of the Gothic invasion complex discussed earlier resurface in these proposals, evoked by these ominous rain clouds and the stormy winds pushing the trees and shrubs in the foreground, Pym's new structure with its great cubic projections and stark cantilevers emerges strong and triumphant, this time shielding staff and collections from any threat. But for most museums, more modest plans for collection care were pursued in the form of permanent off-site storage buildings. And they tended to mostly be repurposed schools, factories, warehouses were often used. In the mid-1960s, the Horniman Museum in London moved its collections to the old Blackwall Lane School, and that's this one on the side there. And then the British Museum had a new store for the Department of Ethnography that was provided in the form of an old warehouse in East London on Osmond Road. I think some of you might have been there before. In some senses, this reuse and adaptation of buildings that had lived earlier lives and held different purposes evokes the ways in which museums utilised former domestic buildings for storage in the way that I've just discussed. But these new storage facilities of the 60s and 70s were actually more carefully conceptualised, specially adapted, and located usually at a greater distance from the main museum. So they also constituted an attempt to move away from the uncanny domesticity of earlier stores through the selection of sites that had their own traditions of institutional efficiency, scientific management, visibility and control. So these feel, I think, for those practitioners at the time, more appropriate for a museum space that's kind of looking to care for, collect and oversee its acquisitions. Actually, in the very early 1900s, ideas about that division between the scholarly and public access to museums had already led to a division between the kind of public-facing galleries and then reserved collections for research students, for example. And the first separate storage buildings had been introduced in the early 20th century in the UK, but quite a lot in Germany, actually. But here we see wartime evacuations and a post-war embarrassment and concern about the state of storage as creating a greater and widespread acceptance that collections should be and could be formally separated from their museums on a long-term basis. And in that way, that it's actually quite a conceptual shift that's happening here, the idea that museums can admit that their spaces are not fit for purpose and that things like this really need to be properly addressed. I just want to go back to these earlier images, or thinking a little bit more about how these shifts in professional practice were understood and visualised by museum workers of the time. As discourses of ideal storage circulated, particularly in the context of increasing collections anxiety, visual depictions of storage became an ever more popular tool to amplify perceived triumphs in collections care and cement a growing professionalisation of the sector. And particularly from 1970 onwards, photographs are regularly shared with museum trustees, colleagues in the sector, and public audiences, and they're really designed to depict model forms of collections care. And while public gallery spaces have long been envisioned by scholars such as Tony Bennett as sites of spectacle and surveillance that use architecture and spatial syntax to regulate objects and bodies, here, behind-the-scenes storerooms become part of the performative space of the museum. And in these apparently candid images, objects are carefully contained, curators display their ability to command and order and control objects, just as in Bennett's exhibitionary complex. So just as the 19th century fairs and museums disciplined bodies through the encouragement of self-regulation, I'm going to argue that these images of storeroom create a discourse of ideal storage that's designed to regulate the museum profession at the time. So we've examined some of these images of the Pitt Rivers Museum already, but I want to show you the wider album that they're part of. And this album's interesting to me because it compares the Gothic horrors of 18 Parks Road with the new off-site store located in a former power station at Osney, in the Osney area of Oxford. And this is the first page of the album, the one with the collage on it, and it literally shows the kind of photographs of Osney's bright lights, industrial equipment, ample space, modern Dexian shelving, and they're pasted over images of the former store. So we get this kind of layering of progress, literally showing the layers of progress that are being implemented in Oxford there. And in this collage and throughout the album, the photographs of the old store before demolition are used as a kind of foil that contrasts with a new era of museum practice. And actually, images are also included of the old store's demolition, and they're a particularly potent sign, I think, of the professionalisation of museum storage. And art historian Linda Need has described how there is a psychic labour in the representation of the past, as there is in the representation of ruin, an ongoing project to repair and make whole again in order to move on to the new and the modern. And so here too, the documenting of the ruins of the Victorian store was a necessary step towards modern collections care. Staff in Cambridge also produced these kind of before and after images of their storage developments. In Cambridge, as in Oxford, they visually documented piled up collections, cramped shelves, bulging racks, so that they could be placed in contrast with the hyper-professionalisation of what happens next. And in these new images of the new stores, the triumph of progress is emphasised through a photographic focus on the spectacle of the storage itself. The spaces are shown as gleaming with light, magnified by the sheen of the modern linoleum floor. The physical bulk of the regimented industrial racking reassuringly dominates this space and controls the collections which are visible, easily accessible, and arranged in neat rows defined by type of object. And I think that they really kind of embody a desire to document and share best practice or major professional shifts in museum practice. And actually, it's quite interesting, I don't know if you can see, some of them actually have kind of pinholes and label numbers where they've clearly been on display for a public audience and kind of paralleled with kind of little display labels saying, look at our fabulous new storage, we are so great and professional. Bristol Museum also kind of describes its before and after of its stores in public newsletters and offers public tours of the new spaces. And what I'm trying to do here is to show how the apparently contemporary phenomenon of public sharing of storage has a longer lineage that can be acknowledged. However, these activities in the 1970s represent some of the contradictions of the more recent phenomenon of visible storage. As several of the contributors to Miriam Brucius and Kavita Singh's volume on museum storage comment, visible storage is actually a performance of storage, in which the museum's specialised knowledge and expertise is privileged over the collections themselves. And this is a quote I really love from curator Nikki Reeves, who argues, through such theatrical visibility, the validity and the justification for the indefinite possession of vast amounts of stuff is assured because that stuff is made visible. That museums might possess more stuff than they can possibly meaningfully deal with, that some of that stuff used to and should rightly belong elsewhere, that museums might use the possession of stuff to maintain social and political hierarchies is rendered mute by putting on display how well they are looked after. Yes, Nikki. Reeves' observations apply to this earlier professional moment too, and particularly in 1970s Cambridge and Bristol, the collections are literally absent or hidden in boxes. Collections management and professionalisation is on display rather than the collections themselves. And some individually, we talked about Peter Gathercole earlier, who did talk about that kind of relationship between empire and storage. But in the main, rather than grappling with the intellectual and moral framing of collections during the mid-20th century period, post-war practice tended to sidestep such questions. And moving beyond these images, there are other sources that also show that kind of performative nature of museum storage at the time. As Reeve argues, in the performance of storage, a new backstage behind the backstage is unavoidable. And indeed, in the 1970s, behind the scenes, the truths of museum work remained at play. So only 2 years after the Horniman Museum established its new store at the Blackwall Lane School, they acknowledged that even in the new storage space, sample checks have revealed that many specimens have even lost their numbers or never been registered, and nearly all the floor space has been exhausted, and the initial supply of storage trays has been used already. It's like so depressing. And actually, you know, the insurance company was really worried about the density of the stored collections. They were kind of expressing concern about and not wanting to insure the space because it was so poorly designed. And I also did a really lovely oral history interview with a woman who used to work there. She did a 2-week work placement there in the 1970s. And she remembers that the museum store was located very close to the famously congested Blackwall Tunnel under the Thames. And the conditions were grim. My God, that was grim. Inside this store, everything was filthy. It was absolutely filthy in there. Most of the objects were covered in some sort of plastic or polythene just to keep the filth off, but it was really unpleasant. Granular, black dirt, because all that traffic was pounding by. The building was not airtight by any means. It was just so dirty. You had to keep washing your hands. It was horrible. So there were hopes that commandeering these more institutional spaces could counter the Gothic hauntings of earlier storage paradigms, and that the performance of professional practice through photography might convince. But the new and the modern remained replete with filth and anxieties generated through past museum practices of over-acquisition, low budgets, and aims in collections care that clashed with the realities of museum practice. So we started this presentation with a brief insight into the British Museum's more recent engagement with the idea of museum storage and the reimagining of storage for an artistic project by an artist with anti-colonial aims. In fact, there's also precedent for this, like one of those boring historians that keeps going, saying, well, we've already done that. But I wanted to just show you two quick clips of a film by the Ghanaian film director, Ni Kwete Owu. Some of you might know it already.
There are vast collections of African art, tools, furniture, music. This is the basement of the British Museum. This is where they keep their vast collections of African art, tools, furniture, musical instruments, and clothes. We are going to have a look at what they have in their collections. Similar collections can be found in museums in all former colonial powers in Europe and America. The main part of these collections was acquired during the period of colonial rule. The objects were brought back to Europe by officers, tradesmen, missionaries, and the colonial specialists called ethnographers. On the whole, the collections represent the looting of a conquering army. When the British Expeditionary Force sacked the city of Benin in 1897, they took with them more than 3,000 pieces of art. Many of them are still locked away and kept in these boxes and plastic bags in these rooms.
I'm so sad that it finishes there, because at that point he starts like brandishing this sword like this. So cool. I'm just going to show you another clip which is similar, but I think it conveys a bit more of the joy and the power of the kind of anti-colonial sentiment.
Amen. Amen. Tamanyaba, 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 tamanyaba. Oh say ye, oh say ye, oh say ye, aye. Oh say ye, oh say ye, oh say ye, oh say ye, aye. Oh say ye.
The colonization of African art in the British Museum.
So this film was shot in the 1970s and it has recently made a resurgence, winning the Paris Short Film Festival Best Documentary Film a couple of years ago, and it's popped up in all sorts of scholarly and activist spaces since. And I think it gets to the heart of some of the issues that we've been discussing today. So Owu, total legend, he managed to convince the keeper of ethnography at the British Museum that he wanted to create a film that would glorify the British Museum and show how well they had looked after their collections. He hired a three-piece suit for the initial interview, and the curator was completely taken in by this guy who was going to kind of, show the message that the British Museum rightfully looked after all of this stuff really beautifully. And then he kind of he invited them to the opening of the film at the Africa Centre in London, and he talks about how they just kind of watched the opening sequence and then just left in kind of absolute horror and disgust about what they were seeing. They were clearly not ready to hear the film's knowledgeable, articulate and devastating critique. And if you have the opportunity to see the longer version, I really recommend it because it's got a lot of narrative over it and really beautifully researched about kind of how these museums were using these spaces, using these materials. Now, I think that the museum's response like that relates to the performative nature of museum storage in the post-war period that we've explored. Despite an array of activities designed to perform access, visibility, best practice, and tackle the end of empire, a willingness to really affect change and actually create change was not yet present. In his investigation of French museums and their relationship to 20th century decolonisation in the post-war period, Robert Aldrich evoked the museum storeroom as a space where visual and material or remnants of imperialism could be, quote, banished in an effort to forget the colonial past and hide the vestiges of colonial culture. In his more recent study of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I'd really recommend this book if you haven't read it already, it's really great, I love it, but I do not like this quote because he says that museum storage creates an in-between position that can slowly build emotional distance from those things that hold us captive in the memories and selves they contain. But I think certainly in the post-war period in British museum practice, the storerooms were not sites which permitted escape from emotions or the realities of colonial collections, and they weren't entirely concealed, forgotten spaces. They generated both extreme anxiety, informed by collections' excess, and that did not let up. It's perhaps worth remembering that the tired strategies of control, surveillance, hierarchying and exclusionary professionalism and the performance of this professionalism didn't really work then, and they might neither address the perceived needs of the collections care of the people who worked in museums, and they also didn't address the needs of the communities that demanded access. And it wasn't good enough then, so what one can do to change that kind of situation today. And in some museums, and I think possibly especially in the US, there is an increasing attention to non-Euro-American modes of collections care. So we've got acknowledgement that some objects shouldn't be seen in this kind of sharing of storage spaces. Individual objects are often acknowledged as needing individualized care rather than standardized care. Western professional standards are acknowledged as not being appropriate for some museum objects, and that some museum objects shouldn't be seen as objects at all, but as living beings that might need food, air, or other forms of care and activation. O's film demands return, but it also encourages to reimagine the storeroom as an embodied, dynamic space of discovery where reframed power relations and new beginnings are possible. So I'm fingers crossed for the future of open museum storage moving forward as well.
So I will let Claire answer some questions, and I know we have some questions coming in from Zoom, and if there are people in the room who would like to come up to the mic, ideally, and ask a question. Yes. Okay.
Excellent, thank you.
Oh, no,
You're very welcome to use that one if you like, I think. Much less
Intimidating. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk. I'm really, really compelled by this idea of the Gothic interpretation of these collections as somebody who started off my academic career in museum studies and now works on Gothic literature.
Oh, fantastic.
So I have many thoughts about that, but I was really curious. On the last trip that I was able to get to the UK, I went to the Shed Museum in Bristol and was able to get a tour of the storage collections there. And I thought that their approach was really interesting. They had these kind of semi-public storage rooms where you could get in, but only with a guide. And that seemed to be a really interesting kind of halfway point to me between these new models of the open visual collection versus the old model of the storeroom. And Bristol's, the Shed stores are a little bit cluttered attic space in some ways, and that's kind of the public presentation of the stores. So I was wondering if you had thoughts about kind of the use of in-between methods like that, and where does the idea of kind of the storeroom tour break off from the exclusive and become something that's offered to any given attendee? I was solicited by a museum docent in a gallery to come join a tour.
Oh, fantastic, really, that's great.
Thanks.
Well, I thank you very much for your question, and we should talk more about museum stores later, and Gothic literature, but I think there is this whole new kind of framing of opportunities for halfway houses now, and the V&A's kind of East storeroom is perhaps that kind of the quintessential example of things being seen as open. But for the last 20 years, lots of museums have been offering, and actually Bristol Museum did offer treasures in store tours as well. It's interesting, we had the most wonderful afternoon at BMA with wonderful colleagues who showed us their collections the other day, but they were very clear that these were the best stores, these were the nice ones that they were happy to show us. And I think there is, of course, you're working so hard, you want to show the best bits. And I think Nikki Reeves's perception that there is always a behind the scenes of behind the scenes. It's just human nature, isn't it, to want to show the best bits. But I think wherever we are kind of traversing that boundary, here certainly not explicitly, but in the tours where it's kind of, you're invited in a more special, it becomes a special occasion, but there are still, I think, those limits. Hi. Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you for coming up.
Do you think that there's going to be any conservational or, structural integrity concerns when it comes to having these public stores? Because they still need to be functional as a storage area, but also kind of aesthetically pleasing if they're going to be public. Do you see any potential long-term ramifications from this?
I think it's really interesting, and I haven't had the opportunity to talk to people who work in open storage spaces very much yet, but I think I have, in my kind of career as a museum professional, I've spent quite a lot of time working in these kind of semi-open spaces where I used to work in something called the Discovery Centre at World Museum Liverpool, where things were on shelves, but it was definitely a gallery space, but it was seen as a kind of hands-on space where you could be a bit more engaged. But those places need huge amounts of human resource to work properly, and I'm really curious to see how they work it out at the V&A, because these are kind of architectural images of what they think it might look like. But to have that kind of opportunity to engage and pull things out and to choose the things that you want, how that's going to be managed in terms of conservation issues like you suggest, but also kind of supporting people to understand the objects properly. I think there's some questions to be held there. I don't know if other people have experience of in the US, because obviously the Luce Centre and other places. It'd be interesting if anyone's got any of that kind of experience. Hi. Oh, sorry.
And then, so let's do Jessica first, and then we can go over there. And you've got some questions on Zoom also.
Hi, nice to see you. Thank you so much for this. I had a question about the aesthetics of the spaces. So I was noticing that, they look much less like cabinets of curiosity and more like clean rooms, like surgical spaces or space-age spaces. And I was wondering what you see that kind of lineage being, like if the kind of aesthetics of the storage spaces in this period were drawing from other kinds of science and technology architectures.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think some of they had very much chosen factory spaces because in the post-war development of Britain, there were lots of empty schools who'd moved on to even more fancy modern spaces, and lots of empty factories where the kind of, the business structure of the UK, the economic model was changing, and so these spaces were available. But I think, certainly not all of them were completely refitted out. There is this kind of, that architectural frame of the factory, of the workhouse, of those kinds of spaces helps. I think museum curators are drawing on that to a certain extent, but partly because that's what they're left with. In terms of where they're getting these ideas from, it's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think curators in the UK were coming to the US to see what was going on. That ICOM had set up very well, was very kind of firmed up by then, and there were lots of kind of people touring each other's museums around Europe and the US. So it could well be the case that they were drawing on experiences, certainly for gallery displays, collections care. A lot of that was coming from Scandinavian countries in particular, and the US as well. But in terms of the kind of architectural lineage of store, I haven't actually explored that. So thank you for that question. It's a really good prompt. I'll let you know how I get on. Hey.
Hi. First of all, thank you. I'm so glad I was able to be here in person because I also studied art history in undergrad and now I'm in museum studies, so this perfectly encapsulates that. So question about if you think that some museums, especially institutions like the British Museum, might be hesitant or resistant to open storage because it would provide greater visibility for the looted objects and could potentially call for greater calls for restitution. And if so, do you think that museums would acquiesce not only to open storage but repatriation, or do you think, similar to the US, it would require some federal laws?
Okay. No, not at all. So I work really closely with colleagues from the British Museum, and it's a really interesting institution in the sense that kind of legally, there is a particular law, some of you might know, that means that it cannot legally repatriate or dispose of objects from its collections unless they're conceived as unfit for care in a museum, which I think can be open to some really interesting interpretation over the next few years if there's willing. And also this idea of duplicates as well, which is a whole different ballgame. I'm well excited to talk about duplicates, but perhaps not on this occasion. And the idea that, and they have trustees who would like to keep their museum intact, and over the last kind of 50 years there's been a real push against any idea of potential repatriation. But curators who work in those stores, who work every day with the communities, who try their best to serve the communities from which these collections came under the strictures of their organisation, are actually really keen to welcome people into these stores all the time. They work every day with communities and delegations coming from around the world to come into these spaces to work with the collections that some might say are rightfully theirs. I think in the UK and museums in the UK more broadly, ones that aren't kind of hamstrung by these national laws, so Cambridge Museum, for example, and the Horniman Museum, museums in Scotland, they are doing all sorts of really interesting repatriation work. And again, you know, Pitt Rivers, for example, bring people into their storage spaces to do this work all the time. So I think things have changed a lot, and especially like on the ground, the people who are doing the work are very keen to kind of open up these spaces and get as many people in as possible. And it's, I think from my experience of talking to colleagues, it's one of the most professionally and personally joyous parts of their work. So I think there is potential there, but the problem is that these are huge institutions that are, where individuals are sometimes butting up against really tricky kind of frameworks as well.
We have some online questions from our Zoom audience. Here's a really interesting one about the digitization of collections. So do you feel that the digitization of collections for public access provides the same value as open storage?
If that person was here, hi world, by the way, I would totally say, well, what do you think? Well, no. At my heart, I love stuff and touching stuff and handling stuff. Obviously, I think digitization has great potential and really exciting opportunities for reframing material, and it's really difficult for people all over the world to come and be with collections. But we had a really lovely discussion at the BMA the other day with artist colleagues who'd worked really closely with the objects that they were drawing, and that kind of, and I get it too. When you handle something, you're like, oh God, this is so oh, this is so cool. So I think digitization does kind of create some barriers, but you know, as we've seen, being with things in real life has its own barriers as well. So you might have to kind of use vinyl gloves. You might have to be there with a curator in the museum space. You've got the vitrines. There are all sorts of kinds of barriers to experience in real life as well as digital. And sometimes, you know, those amazing quality of the digital can actually offer huge opportunity for really grappling with the materiality of the object that we might not actually get when we're in these spaces anyway, because everything's behind a box.
I think maybe we need to have a few voices from inside. I was recently retired, and after over 30 years at the Walters Art Museum as a curator, not as a registrar, but I first of all, I would like to speak up for registrars and their professionalization, in that I think they've always been very professional, in my view, but what has changed has been the introduction of technology. And technology, different kinds of online systems, et cetera, for organizing data and keeping track of it, has saved an incredible number of hours of work so that they could turn their attention to other things as well. But it has always been underfunded. And so I think even, I can only imagine, I don't know storage units in London, I will admit, but I know they're underfunded, for sure. And if you're completely underfunded, there's a limit to what you can do. And I wouldn't assign them as being less professional. If you don't have the funds to buy the equipment, to make improve your organization, you're not going to get anywhere. So I think every place, registrarial efforts look more professional to an outsider now than they were, but that's because of the technology that's helped all kinds of industries to organize data more effectively. Also, another question I would like to raise, I think in terms of what appears to be jumbled storage versus more organized storage, as you have here, wouldn't be only non-European, et cetera, objects. I think the problem of having too much stuff, having no money, getting no money for more shelving or whatever, you can't get it, you don't have enough staff, you don't have the technology. It's going to be British art also, I'm sure, in the UK, which didn't come in. I mean, I think that's got to be a little bit fair here. I don't see this actually. When I look at this, I don't see this as just being imperialist. I see it as a general problem of dealing with objects that you would like to take better care of, but until you get the funding, you are very hard pressed to do that. So I just want to, you know, their hearts are, and their professionalism are very high. You know, the museum world doesn't exactly pay the best salaries. But many people are desperate to work in museums because they love the stuff, you know.
Two really good points there. Thank you so much. And I think that question of, I certainly don't want to kind of suggest that these are professional models and endorse them as only ways of doing things. In fact, in some ways, these are, they're problematic. One of the things that I want to do is kind of problematize those issues of professionalization in some of the work that I'm doing. And that question of budgets is so important as well. I don't know, though, if you know this book, Museum Activism, by Richard Sandel and James, and they say money doesn't matter. We have to. Now is the time when we can be museum activists. And when I read that, I just think, what? Like, okay, but you know, things still cost money, and we live in a capitalist system. And the museum, you know, you can't just not defund the museum if you want it to kind of perform in ways that serve communities properly. So I absolutely appreciate your point, and I also completely agree that most of the storage spaces for museums of collections that are broader than ethnographic material would also have looked similarly, although I do think that in the post-war period particularly, ethnography was seen as this really kind of unfashionable, very kind of low status aspect of the collection. And, you know, there are kind of reports of Leeds Museum in particular, where the storeroom is where collections of ethnography are strewn around the floor because curators have taken the boxes for the local history, the industrial history, which was increasingly important for curators at that time, and you know the African stuff that had been symbolic of the colonial period was really, really very, very denigrated at that time. So I think ethnography does always get the worst of it, particularly in this period. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
I've really enjoyed this talk. It's been really interesting. I just wanted to bring it back to the question of like repatriation. And I was just wondering, like, are these open access like storage spaces being used as an alternative to repatriation? Yeah.
A really good question, and I think one of the things that I've hinted at here is that by making things look beautiful, you can really make the argument that they don't need to go back because this is where it is. And a lot of the repatriation discourse, certainly in the 70s, but even now, it's still the same. Like, we can look after it better than you, which is deeply offensive, deeply problematic, and actually not true. And especially when you think about what looking after might mean. Yeah, I think that still goes on a little bit here, but I also think that there is excitement that opening up more collections might support a greater discourse of collaboration, greater discourse of visibility that enables more kind of collaboration. And certainly there's so many examples now in the UK, but also in the US, where repatriation has been an incredibly fruitful and exciting opportunity for museum professionals to get to know more about their collections, to change their ways of thinking about the world. So I hope I can imagine at least some of these curators are excited about what that might bring, even though I'm sure they're a bit nervous about it as well. Yeah. Carly, do you want to come up?
Thank you. I'm so glad you have this picture up because it relates to my question. But I was just wondering how you see both the physical movement and the physical organization corresponding with the data organization. So here you have a giant mess of things, hodgepodge, your quote about African things and Polynesian things not being separated, but here you have, neat displays, and they're probably categorized by a place, and if that is also corresponding to kind of a re-entrenchment of different colonial ideas of where something comes from, and if there's any kind of correlation between like the bucket something is put in and the way it's stored.
Yes, it's almost like you work in museums. Yeah, absolutely. So documentation also goes through a massive shift alongside this professionalization of storage spaces as well, and the kind of categorization of museum practice mirrors exactly with the kind of, well, we see, there are lots of increasing manuals that are being shared across the sector that are produced by curators who are working in these spaces, but it's very much from a discourse of social anthropology that it comes through, which is very much, so some of it is kind of geographical, but there is also a question of typology, so how things might most, big things go together, small things go together, because that's easier to look after. And also kind of questions of materials are slowly coming in at this time. Conservation science is really burgeoning in this period too. It's all happening on all fronts. So there is a kind of increasing acknowledgement of how different materials need different things. So the British Museum, for example, has a textiles store dedicated at the time. And certainly documentation is very much along the lines of anthropological classifications that come from structuralist anthropology at the time. So they're thinking about kinship, they're thinking about kind of religious things might go together. I think in terms of the storage, I mean, as I've shown, it looks nice for about 5 minutes, but then it all goes to pot later on. And certainly at the Horniman Museum, there was a young social anthropologist graduate who was trying to make things kind of align things with, you know, kinship or pottery or textiles. But in practice, I think, you know, it was very difficult to realise that kind of structuralist dream in the end. There's a question, I think, over here as well.
Thanks again for your great talk. You mentioned very briefly scientific management. Was there the direct adoption of like Taylorism in museums?
No, it's a good question. I'm going to have to this history of science bunch over here are throwing me all the good questions here. But I actually have absolutely no idea, and but it would be really something to look into. Thank you. Yeah, hi. Another history of science person. Oh no, that's where all the hard questions are coming from.
It will not be a history of science question. It'll be an architecture and museum question, but I was interested in the other half of the story, or the other part of the story. That is museums in former colonies. And Ghana is an excellent case because you have Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew. Yes, they're doing universities, they're doing other things, but one of the first things they do is a museum. And I'm interested in storage spaces, but also curatorial practice and how much that's inflected, just like architectural practice is, despite political independence.
So Ghana's museum service in the 60s is absolutely gorgeous. It does not look like this. It is really just kind of the model of kind of ICOM's best practice at that time. And actually a lot of that was reported on in British journals of museums at the time as kind of, you know, this is what's happening over here. And some of the discourse around repatriation is early examples of repatriation, so in the 50s and 60s, is making the case that these new museums that are being developed, particularly in West Africa, are ready, you know. I mean, there is a kind of hugely paternalistic discourse going on there as well, and a lot of the argument that I make in the book is that people are only willing to repatriate because they don't want to look after it themselves, because they don't see it as valuable at this time, which kind of speaks to that question of whether European art might be treated the same. But yeah, absolutely, there's a real discourse, and actually there was a huge movement of people between West Africa, India, North America. I've talked a little bit about North America and Scandinavia, but there were a lot of kind of training programs. British museums were constantly hosting delegations to kind of learn about best practice, particularly in conservation and education, actually. But it was a two-way street, and actually even in programs where British professionals were going out to teach West Africans how to run a museum, there's been some really interesting research by a PhD student of mine actually on actually how two-way those exchanges were, and how much came back from West Africa to make British museum practice potentially more interesting and better, according to these standards. Thank you for your question.
So just to say thank you to Claire, thank you to the audience here, thank you to the audience on Zoom. We're so thrilled to bring everybody together. Thank you again. Let's come together to thank Claire for this wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. It's lovely to have those really interesting questions.